Hi, everybody. Okay, I think we're going to get started. We have I think a great and interesting panel and some really fabulous panelists. I'm Michael Jacobson. I'm the director of the City University of New York Institute for State and Local Governance, also a professor of sociology here at the Graduate Center. This panel and this series that we've done, this is the last of three we've done on jails, is co-sponsored by us and the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs. And I think the Graduate Center, as most people know here, is the hub of doctoral education in the CUNY system, and many of our faculty and students work on pressing public issues like the ones you'll be hearing about tonight and others that you hear about through these programs. So I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists. They're all very distinguished, so they have long, extensive bios. I'm going to give a 30-second high-level introduction to each one. You can go online to get their more extensive bios and then turn it over to Julio Medina, who will moderate the panel for us. So on Zoom, to the left here, we have Leann Bertsch, who is a Senior Vice President for Corrections at Management and Training Corporation, where she's worked since 2020. Prior to that, she served 15 years as the Director of the North Dakota Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where she worked to reform the system from one that focused on punishment to one oriented toward repairing the harm crime caused to individuals, families, and communities. The other person on Zoom who you see is John Wetzel, and John served over 30 years in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, most recently as the Secretary of Corrections before retiring in 2021 and starting for NEMA Justice Strategies. In his years at the Pennsylvania Department of Correction, he worked as a correctional officer, treatment counselor, training director, and warden, among other roles, and he retired in 2021 as the longest-serving Secretary of Corrections in the history of Pennsylvania. On our panel here, to the left, we have Luis Quinones, who is a program manager for elder services at Correctional Health Services at the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation. There he's worked on Rikers Island for 8 years, connecting people over 55 with jail supports and discharge planning. Next to him is Stanley Richards, who's the Deputy CEO at the Forson Society, a New York City-based service and advocacy organization that works to promote alternatives to incarceration and successful reentry from prison. In his decades of experience in justice reform, he served as the first Deputy Commissioner of Programs and Operations at the New York City Department of Correction, on the Lippman Commission to close Rikers Island, and is the first formerly incarcerated person to be appointed to the New York City Board of Correction. Finally, our moderator, Julio Medina, is the founder, executive director, and CEO of Exodus Transitional Community, which delivers innovative programming for adults and youth affected by the legal system. Julio began Exodus in 1999 after serving a 12-year prison sentence where he witnessed firsthand both the damage incarceration does and the desire people held behind bars to transform their lives. So that's our panel. It's going to be a great discussion, and Julio, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you all for coming out.
Use the mic.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. This is a great turnout, and we have an opportunity to really explore jails and prisons, not only in New York, but across the country. So let me just say the United States still has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Despite being at its lowest 20 years, the number of people confined has increased by 500% over the last 40 years and costs approximately $80 billion annually. I want to say that again, $80 billion annually. Mass incarceration in the United States has led to overcrowded conditions, causing unsanitary conditions, increased health risks, and decreased psychological well-being. In New York City, chronic correction officer absenteeism, lack of appropriate health care, both mental and physical health care, and the general and punitive culture of our city's confinement system has contributed to the deaths of 18 people in jail this year, putting 2022 on track to be the deadliest year in nearly a decade. So people should not go into jail to die. And I think that's just important to highlight. These tragic deaths, along with the death row decisions overturned at the last hour and calls for necessary reform to draconian laws, have been sparked a movement in criminal justice reform, which is now front and center in a national conversation. And those are our advocates across the country that are doing this work. The cause to end mass incarceration has grown, we can see it daily from grassroots organized celebrities like John Legend and Kim Kardashian. We've heard the stories how they now got involved to use their name to kind of highlight some of the injustices that are taking place in this country. So, as we know, any reform doesn't happen without all of you, right? Your political vote, as well as political will from those in power. So it's important, the organizers, all of us, the advocates, that we work together to try to find smaller, safer jails, not only in New York City, but across the country. And we have an exciting group. This is the most you'll hear from me this evening, because we have some fantastic people here that really are going to talk about this experience and talk about what some of these things mean, not only locally, but nationally. So I'd like to begin with a good friend, Brother Stanley Richards, who's as his bio does him a disservice with all the work he's done. He's been a first in every aspect of this work, and I congratulate him as much as I possibly can. So just one of the questions, Stanley, I want to begin, in New York City, the Bertsch jail plan is currently underway. Can you describe this plan and what makes this alternative better for both justice and public safety? What is the pathway to get there?
The pathway, I think, is a hard pathway. It's going to take, as you said, all of us. The vision for the borough-based jails is really to shift the dynamic of incarceration in New York City. Over the decades, incarceration has went from detention to punishment, in part by the facilities being so old and the facilities being one of the ways in which people get weapons. The facilities and the isolation of Rikers Island really speaks to how the city sees people who are incarcerated and officers. And the borough-based jails is an opportunity for New York City to do a couple of things. One, by building the borough-based jails, create a smaller footprint for New York City, thereby reducing mass incarceration. Right now, Rikers Island has about the capacity of 11,000 beds. The borough-based jail system would be a capacity of around 3,500. So in a way, taking the new facilities will be able to reduce the footprint of mass incarceration. Two, the borough-based jails is an opportunity for us to center the facilities on the humanity of those who are detained there and those who work there. The facilities on Rikers Island and the current borough-based facilities we have was never designed for the kind of humanity we're talking about today, where services are part of the detention experience, where openness and movement and furniture and color and design is used to say something to people, that while we need to detain you, doesn't mean that you get treated like an animal, like you matter. We get to say to officers, you're doing hard work, and we're going to recognize your humanity as well. So we don't have a system that has winners and losers that we have right now. We can have winners and winners. So the borough-based jail system really is an opportunity for us to use design, not as the fix-all, because we talked about, we don't want the culture that's existing now to be transported into the borough-based facilities, but it is a way to really center the humanity of those who are going to be impacted. And I've seen some of the early designs of what the borough-based facilities will look like. It is an opportunity to really center the work around services, openness, safety, and for people who are incarcerated and for the officers. And so the path there is going to be hard. You see the numbers, we're up to 5,900 now, it's going up. We don't see the kind of will to really be leading in this effort. That's going to take both diversion and a reduction in the population to get to the 3,500 that we need. We need to really address the fact that 50% of the people who are incarcerated in New York City jails have a mental health issue. That is not where they belong. And yes, the city's building some capacity to be able to move some of those people on, but we're talking about 300 beds when right now we have over 50%. So we need the kind of leadership that says this is going to be a multi-pronged approach, one being the borough-based jails, two being population reduction, three being right-sizing who goes into those systems, as opposed to a catch-all.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me jump to John. John, what programs did you implement that promoted positive change in those incarcerated? How did it affect the conditions of the correctional facilities?
Well, first of all, thank you, and to my fellow panelists, it's great to see you all. Stanley, I was hoping to be there in person. You got to catch up soon. Honestly, I think the primary antidote to the things we're not comfortable with in corrections is transparency. Opaque systems that are populated by people who don't have the political voice to move things is a recipe for disaster. And I think jails have the perfect opportunity. And, Stanley talking about the Rikers plan. And, it's been my observation, and not to correct Jacobson, but I spent my first 20 years working in jails. I started as a part-time correctional officer in a county jail and ended as a warden of a county jail. And I will tell you, comparing jails to prisons, the further the facility is away from the community, the more likely it is to be opaque and less healthy, frankly, for all involved. So I think when you talk about a community plan in Rikers, or when you look around a state like Pennsylvania that has 60 jails, you really think that some of the strengths of a jail are that the staff and the incarcerated people generally come from the same community. So there shouldn't be this notion of humanization, right? At the state prison level, one of the things that shocked me was the need to really humanize folks, because most of our staff didn't come from where most of our incarcerated people came from. You have an opportunity to not have that in jails, and I think it's a real strength. I'll wrap up by pointing you all to Chicago and Chicago Beyond, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nika Jones-Tapia and some of the work she's doing around this concept of holistic safety. But I really think it captures something that a bunch of us, probably who got our experience on both sides of the bars, acknowledges, and that's that the fate of incarcerated people and the people who work in jails and prisons is inextricably linked. I'm not aware of a circumstance where one side's doing great and the other side's doing poorly. And so, to be honest, these conditions in jails and prisons is a reflection on our apathy around both sides of that bar. And so I do think that transparency and measuring things and having leaders like my colleague, Leann Bertsch, I think if you look at folks who are so-called reformers, good, bad, or ugly, transparency is the root. I mean, it has to start with being honest and open. And I'll tell you, as a guy who ran a system that had as many as 27 prisons, having everybody understand that anyone, including legislators or anybody, could walk in any prison or jail in Pennsylvania at any time was a really important informal control.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Leann, speaking about some of the work, so in North Dakota, it's not commonly known to adapt reform practices when it comes to incarceration, at least from what I know. What inspired you to change how the prison system operated? How did you go about doing this? How many of these changes were applicable to the discussion of jails as opposed to long-term prisoners?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and appreciate being on this panel with people I truly admire. So North Dakota is a very small system and still probably the smallest system in the United States today, and I took pride in keeping it that way. Even though North Dakota probably wasn't known to be a reformer state, it's probably because it was so small that wasn't where the attention was. But my experience was small, humane, doing a lot of good things. And then I had the opportunity to see a better way when I studied the Scandinavian system and brought back some of their principles of normality and dynamic security, and really didn't think it would be a heavy lift. And I was really in for a rude awakening in that when you actually ask staff to care about the people in your care, custody, and control, and to treat them like human beings, even in a small state that I thought was extremely humane, it was a heavy lift. And we got to where we needed to be, and the work is still going on. And the one thing, when you say, how is that transferable to jails? I had oversight of all of the county and regional jails when I was the director in North Dakota, and it was probably my least favorite part of the job. And I wasn't on the sheriff's Christmas card mailing list when he had to take action, because the jails are typically under the authority of county commissioners who don't really know much about jails, and sheriffs don't typically know much about custody. And so when we would have to go in and inspect and how to take compliance actions, there was a real resistance, and it really came down to culture and really how the community thought about how people in jail should be treated. And one of my worst nightmares was a larger jail, and the sheriff and all of the staff in that jail really believed that the prisoners didn't deserve any medical care, that they deserved to be treated less than human, and the county commission didn't put any money into it, and some pretty horrendous things came out of that jail, and the Department of Corrections ended up taking over the jail for 2 years, putting our own administrator in there until we could actually reform the way they thought about how people should be cared for. And that was a real hallmark moment, I think, in how jails are run in North Dakota, knowing that a state agency had that kind of power to actually do that. But I'll tell you, it wasn't easy, because there was a lot of backlash about maybe overusing my authority on a county level. But at the end of the day, when I was able to talk about this could be your brother, sister, child at any given time when they were arrested and put in that jail that could suffer those consequences, I think it got their attention. And so I sometimes think that part of the challenge is breaking down that we, them, any one of us at any given time could end up in a jail situation, and we should be thinking about what we want that experience to look like so that we don't come out worse than when we went in.
Well, thank you so much, Leann. Louis, as someone who works directly with those in jail, what do you think their primary needs are while incarcerated? What do you need to set them up for success when they return to the community?
Thank you for allowing me to be here. I actually feel like the oddball having to give this caveat or this pre-introduction to what I'm about to say, but while I'm employed by health and hospitals, the ideals, the views that I hold in no way reflect the company. I'm speaking as an individual, Louis Quinones, and what I will say is that I'm one of the few people, similar to Mr. Richards, I never thought about it that way, while he was higher up, that's actually employed by a place that once held me. I was incarcerated for 18 years for something that I completely disagree with, and think of 5 different ways on how I could have handled it differently. It's with great shame that I speak that. What I will say is that what worked for me and what is working in my continual working with people that are being released out of the criminal justice system, I have to highlight the fact that people that are being released out of a jail system is completely different to someone that's being released out of a state system, as my esteemed panelist has stated. It was some wise men that began pioneering this vision and this view. Discharge planning only began about 40 years ago. Most people don't know that. Out of the Attica insurrections It was one of the terminologies that people had stated because of the inhumane conditions that was actually taking place. So with that said, the major thing is the focus on people and being treated as humane. But with that, there's an isolation that's actually taking place. This us-them mentality, particularly out of the New York City regions, that has to be addressed in a certain way. I had the unique position of being able to, while not only being incarcerated, had a family member that actually worked in the jail systems. My sister actually retired as a corrections officer, and I think it gave her the keen insight of realizing that I have a family member that's inside of here. So my treatment of individuals is as them as individuals and treating them as I would treat a family member on being released from prison, trying to have the most humane services available, sending them to Exodus, sending them to Fortune, with the referral of talking to someone on the outside so that it is not dropped off at a street corner. They have a name in which to go to, an office in which to go to, a doctor's appointment in which to follow up on, and then just a phone call that comes with that. I do want to highlight something that my company has placed, not speaking for health and hospitals, but saying that they have a phone home program, a locker system, that when people are being released out of Rikers Island right now, they're able to go to that locker and access a cell phone in which to call these different agencies. And that's something that I believe has to be highlighted and something that's great and even taking place.
Thank you, thank you. So just a general question for our audience. You know, when we think about the purpose of jails, right, and how does it differ from our prison system, and basically the goal of confinement, right? Has it evolved over the years? Are we still back 20, 30, 40 years ago, or has there been some evolution more towards, hey, the humanization of people that are inside? Because I've heard all of us kind of talk about that. So, Stanley, you want to?
Yeah, I'll start with, I think we're still striving for the humanization for people who are incarcerated. And I think that the evolution of our system, particularly here in New York, right? Jail was designed to detain people while they get their cases adjudicated. And in New York City, what we've seen with the explosion of incarceration going up to 22,000 people in the system. When I was in the system, it took me 2.5 years to get my case adjudicated. So I was on Rikers for 2.5 years. And the time to get your case adjudicated hasn't changed much from that when you look at the length of time it takes for people. So our jails have become almost like prisons where people spend over a year in there just going back and forth to court, just getting their case adjudicated.
Easy.
Two, that the jail in New York City has turned into institution that houses people with mental illness and behavioral health issues, right? It was never set up for that. The workforce was never trained for that. And then you combine that with facilities that have aged out and have not been structured in a way that really supports the engagement. You're talking about the one-on-one, talking about the humanity. And so, yeah, the way jails are being used right now, it's as a tool of punishment. And you even hear some of the officers or some of the people from the union, I know when I talk about them, they talk about people who are incarcerated as if they are bad people. And I understand, hurt people. So they are coming from a place of hurt themselves. But that's what they do. They talk about people as if people have been tried and convicted, and they are, in some ways, the judge and the jury and the punisher. And so, yes, the system has evolved in a way that has done more harm. And part of the work that we're doing as a coalition, as service providers and advocates, and as a community of caring New Yorkers, is to say, we can do better than that. We could have safe communities, smaller jails, and resource communities so that we don't have to use incarceration as a way to isolate people and punish people before their cases get adjudicated.
Excellent. Leann, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so I can't agree more than that with Stanley. So one of the things we did in North Dakota, because it was very apparent that there wasn't a lot of motivation at the county level, the regional level, to put services in jails. And because they're funded by the counties, and so if there was any incentives, the state needed to fund those opportunities to give them incentives to do something different. And that was really very, very frustrating, but also kind of a wake-up call that there was a better way to do good work in some of those jails. And so from the state standpoint, we came in and actually gave them incentives to provide alternatives to incarceration, and advocated at the state level that we should take on the funding of pretrial services, because it was very apparent to me, even in a small, pretty homogeneous state like North Dakota, there was an overrepresentation of minorities sitting in jail for longer periods of time than our Caucasian counterparts. And that was a heavy lift, but we got it done. So now there's pretrial services. I pointed to the federal system where about 20% were detained and 80% were put on pretrial release, as in the state it was 80% were detained and 20% were actually getting any type of bond. And so I'm very happy to say that there's fewer people sitting in their pretrial, which we know if you serve a long time pretrial, the likelihood of your case to end in a more negative manner is very true. So I think the one thing Stanley said is jails have become the default for people with mental health issues that need help. They shouldn't be out on the street with some of the issues that they're dealing with, and jails are absolutely the wrong place for them to be. And there needs to be community support to provide alternative services for people struggling with mental health issues, because I guarantee you jails are not physical plant equipped to deal with it, and the staff are not trained to deal with people with serious mental health issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. John, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's areas where we've made tremendous progress. I mean, when I first started in corrections in the late 80s, it was the beginning, I think, where we were seeing the get tough on crime policies translate into an increase in incarceration. And I wouldn't have imagined when I first started some of the stuff that happens around the country. We hosted a TED event inside 2 prisons in an election year with a conservative Republican governor. That statement alone in the 80s would have been like in The Onion, back when that actually existed and the actual headlines weren't crazier than the lampooned ones. But I think I look back just over the decade or a little more than a decade I was Secretary of Corrections, where you had the field of corrections directors, ASCA, the group that Leann was the president of, that's now CLA, putting a resolution out to reduce the use of solitary confinement. And we're talking in the 2014, 2015. So we've seen pockets of progress. I think what's challenging is that we see so far to go. And there's areas where we've certainly taken a step back. I think Leann brings it up, and the foremost area where as a country we've taken a step back is just our refusal to deal with behavioral health issues, both addiction and mental illness, in a non-punitive, non-criminal justice response. And you can say, oh, we have this and that. Bullshit. Bullshit. 75% of the population at the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections before I left with a substance use disorder, 35% on the mental health roster, 65, 70% of the female population on the mental health roster. And these are things where we got to stop looking. Part of the answer is we got to stop looking through a criminal justice lens to solve problems that aren't criminal justice oriented or created, right? And so you can't have a discussion around criminal justice reform or corrections reform without having a responsibility about a discussion about having a responsible behavioral health safety net in the community that keep people out of the system in the first place.
Agree, John. The criminalization of both mental health and addiction has been ravaging our country, and our jails are filled with folk with addiction. So thank you for that. I'm sorry, just saying what you wanted to.
I appreciate what you just said too, John, is that sometimes we get lost in how far we have yet to go, and don't really appreciate and lift up how far we have come. And I totally agree with you. I look at New York State, right? There was one time when New York State had 72,000 people incarcerated in our New York State prisons. And according to docs right now, we're about 30,000 people, right? And so we have made progress, right? We still have about 33,000 people on parole. We had 22,000 people incarcerated in New York City jails. We're down to 5,900. That number is going up, but we have come a long way in terms of the way that we have criminalized and incarcerated people in New York. We have a long way to go, but we have made real progress. You know, I was appointed to the governor's prison closure commission. We're closing 12 prisons, and we hope to be building out a roadmap for states across the country to say, as we reduce our population in prison, what do we do with those facilities to both provide economic resources to the local communities, the surrounding communities, and how do we close them so we never use them again, right? And so we have come a long way, and I think it's important to appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Louis, you want to add to anything? What?
So it's funny because as the panel continues talking, I'm hearing the difference and the pendulum swing from macro to when it comes to me, it's always on a micro level. As a direct person that's meeting with people and talking to them, I found that to make things more humane is probably to address the issues that came out of the Sing Sing prison from the Eddie Ellis's and Georgie Prentice's, and that came out of a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice issues. What they found was that 75% of the individuals that were filling the New York State prisons were coming from segmented communities within New York City, the South Bronx, East New York, Brownsville, Queens, Jamaica, South Jamaica, Queens, and so on and so forth. And you would see your friends inside of the prison system. And the things that came out of that was that in those communities, they had things that were known as crime generative factors. They would go to school and they would see people, their schools would look like prisons. And they still look like prisons inside of these communities. And it's sad because it's not changing the problem at its core. It's a multifaceted approach. These communities need to be revamped from a state, a local, as well as a jurisdictional level. You know, all of these things need to approach. But to give a quick answer, maybe green trainings inside of the prison systems. If people are being sent to jails for an extensive period of time, how about training programs, green training programs, as everything keeps on evolving and changing to that? Computer skills may be taught. All of these things change the mindset that's not only created in these specific communities, but transforms the people within. So, you know, schooling, trades, for those that may have a mental disorder or anything of that nature, they could still learn certain trades to keep up and move on, appropriate medical things, and addressing that substance issue. As, you know, the esteemed panelists had basically stated, with the rise of fentanyl, there needs to be a national response altogether.
Agree. You know, as we think about the jails and we're thinking about prisons and we're thinking about kind of how do we make this more humane, right now New York City is in this place where it's supposed to be smaller, safer jails. We're supposed to be building, as Stanley mentioned, 4 jails. Staten Island didn't get a jail for whatever reasons. But 4 jails in every borough, 900 beds per jail, some 3,400 people in that. Again, as we talked about, very light. But, you know, we want to just think about culture and how do you change a culture in order to make these prisons more humane. And anyone can just jump in here because, you know, we have some experts on the field. But what are some of the things that we can do for jail to look more humane? And how do we promote this? You know, how does this look when someone gets released? where recidivism rates are cut in half. What does this look like? What does a successful model look like?
Yeah, I think to address the culture, and we have to address the culture, I think it starts from recruitment, it starts from training, it starts with the leadership. Talking about the Norwegian model, they did their transformation from a constitutional perspective, right? And it wasn't, they used facility design in it, right? But they changed their constitution about the inherent value that you have as a citizen, period. Not what you did, not how much time you spent in prison, that the obligation of you maintaining your humanity didn't depend on whether you was convicted or not. That no matter what your outcome in life is, that you maintain your humanity. And then they built a prison system around that with the policies that spoke to the humanity, talking about dynamic security, right? Where officers, their training, 2-year training, was like ownership, like their responsibility wasn't care, custody, and control. Their responsibility was to ensure that people in their care were prepared for life on the outside. And so living conditions were normalized. It was an amazing, amazing way of saying, we got to hold you accountable, right? And your accountability is we're going to remove you from the community. Conditions of confinement was not part of the punishment. Isolation, not part of the punishment. Removal from your community was the punishment. The obligation of the country was to make sure that you're ready to go back. And so normalizing the environment. And that's the culture change we need.
Yeah.
And so they have officers that, they don't call them officers, they call them contact officers. Because their job is to be in contact with you all the time. So when you get that letter that you might not be so happy about, they can pull you off to the side, you're all right, and they can have a conversation with you. They become part of your support network in the prison. And that's the kind of cultural change we need to have. I can tell you, our academy, you're in there for 6 months, you're doing the basics to get your peace officer certification, and then there's some additional trainings around, crisis intervention and things like that. We need to move away from that. We're talking about changing culture. Changing culture starts with our commitment to training people to be prepared for the 21st century jails and not the 20th century jails.
Excellent. Leann, I see you shaking your head there, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a heavy lifting. And the thing, when you think about the Norwegian model in their prison system, prisons and jails are just a microcosm of the environment where they exist. And so you can't change a correction system, whether jail or prison, until you have buy-in by the total government, the environment, the rest of the system. I was a prosecutor before I came over to corrections. And so when I started making some of these reforms that felt soft on crime, according to some, I had a lot of prosecutors and judges that were very angry because they wanted prisons and incarceration to be harsh. And until everyone gets on the same page, and we're not a cohesive country like the Norwegians are, it's going to be a much, much heavier lift, because at the end of the day, no one really wants to invest in that part of the system like the Norwegians invested in. And so I would say this. So, you're almost damned if you do and damned if you don't. We were starting to do some really great things, pushing into the jails and prisons, and it almost gave permission to judges and prosecutors to think it was okay to recommend or actually hand down an incarcerative sentence to someone who shouldn't necessarily be incarcerated, because they were going to get treatment and programs and resources in jail and prison. And that's the wrong place for those services to be delivered if that person doesn't need to be there. And when we were doing justice reinvestment, and we did a survey, 70% of the judges said they sent nonviolent people, low-risk nonviolent people, into jail and prison to access services. And so it's a real conundrum as far as we want our systems, our correctional systems, to be safe and humane, but we don't want to give permission to the other pieces, the other participants in the criminal justice system, to think it's okay to make that the fail-safe and the ultimate place for people to land.
Thank you so much. John, you want to?
Yeah, I have a slightly different thought, but I'll come back to it. I think part of the issue in corrections, especially jails, is that we as a society have criminalized immature acts, especially in poor communities and when young black boys do it, black and brown. And I think, part of the answer is to expand the margin of error and stop using the criminal justice system as a default. And I'll tell you that, what we know about, and I've, done a fair amount of work in this area, what happens when a young man of color drops out of school is a 70% lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated. And how that translates here in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you something that it hurts me to even say out loud, but we commissioned a study with Bruce Western, who's now up there at Columbia at the Justice Lab. And I literally said, Bruce, come in and you have 100% access to all our restrictive housing units. You study whatever you want. Interesting thing happened during that study. My correctional staff said, you're studying incarcerated people, can you study us too? So we got a really comprehensive study, but one of the probably the saddest thing under my career that came out of it was what we found is that of young black men who were born in the 80s in Philadelphia, 1 in 8 ended up in solitary confinement in Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. I'm going to say that again because I didn't say it wrong. 1 in 8 black incarcerated people, black men from Philly who were born in the 80s ended up in solitary confinement, not just incarcerated. There is a direct link. I mean, go back a generation to get tough on crime area. We removed men largely from the community, and that had an impact. And I think we're seeing it again. So the first and foremost to the system is stop using the damn system so much. Build a margin of error in. Let's match up practices in schools with what we know works. I was tangentially involved in the consensus report on school discipline by the Council of State Governments Justice Center that pointed out the same kind of inequities we see in the criminal justice system in the school system. When you look at the system and how to fix it, again, you need leaders with transparency. Bruce Wester doesn't get to do a study like that if I didn't want to get fired anyhow because I was tired of being in the job. So I said, come in and look at it and let's report it publicly. Data. The criminal justice system does a terrible job of collecting data. And even when systems do collect data, we rarely have the same language. So to have comparative statistics across the country, even across counties in the same state, are often difficult. Tell me a practice, tell me a public policy that can change without accurate data. Our practices have to match research. We know that the more punitive, especially for people who are lower risk, the worse the outcomes are going to be. If we cared about outcomes, we'd change what the system looked like. And that goes to the political environment that happens. And this happens in a political environment where I would honestly say we make a choice. We make a choice. I think the good news is that we have a national staffing crisis that's going to force us to change culture. Because the field is evolving to a place where we're going to have to be good workplaces. And guess what? There's very few jails and prisons that are good workplaces. So we're going to quickly get to a place, and some systems are there already, where we just don't have the staff to do business as usual. And the question will be, what kind of political courage will we have? Will we try to find a way to reduce the footprint of the system, which has to happen? It's a system that the closer you get to it and the longer you're into it, the more damage it does to you, no matter what side of the system you're on, what that's going to look like. But I do say I'm optimistic because I don't think we're going to have a choice. We're going to have to create more healthy environments inside prisons and jails.
Thank you. And with costs continually rising in New York, we got $600,000, I think was the last cost I seen per person That's on Rikers Island. So we want to go to our audience now. Some questions. I see somebody in the back.
Thank you so much for this presentation. As you mentioned, there's $80 billion a year spent on prisons. There are for-profit prisons that are built, and there's a police quota, so the system needs prisoners because somebody makes a lot of money, and some people get really nice retirement package from their work. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure. We saw the upstate facilities, even trying to close one that Stanley was on it. There was so much community pushback around closing a prison. In the upstate prisons in New York, it's the entire economy for a town. In Dannemora, in Auburn, the entire, there's 3 officers that are brothers that are working in a facility. Their grandmother works in commissary. No, this is, I'm not making this up. So the entire families of this town survive off that prison. So I think the bigger question is, how do we replace that, right? The farming industry went away, so those who were farmers became correction officers. I think the broader question is, what do we do to create a sustainable economy for those upstate counties where prisons no longer have to be what they rely on? And I don't have the answer for that, so I don't know if anybody else does.
There's going to be a report. Governor Hochul is going to be putting out a report from the Prison Closure Commission about how do we take those closed prisons and turn them into an economic opportunity so that we don't have to rely on the trauma of incarcerating Black and brown people to have economic viability for some of the communities where prisons are located at. But let me say another thing about that $80 billion. That $80 billion is also, I think, an opportunity for us nationally to have a conversation about making investments. As John said, we have a choice as a country that we either invest in jails and prisons and the damage and the perpetual damage to local communities, or we could shift that. And I think we have seen over the years a shift in the thinking. We have seen people on the other side of the aisle who said we need to be tough on crime and we need to incarcerate, to now say, wait a minute, economically, we're spending a lot of money on this. Is this worth it? Is there a better alternative? So I think that number provides us an opportunity to center our work on how do we reduce that and invest it in other things. Quickly, I'll tell you a story. When I was in prison, my oldest son, who's now 41, came to visit me. And he said something that shocked me to my core that I didn't even think about. And it was a family day. And family days usually happen in the gym. And me and my son was playing basketball. And he said, Daddy, do I have to commit a crime to come and play in a gym like this? And it was like, what? We're from the Bronx, we're from Soundview Projects. It didn't even dawn on me that my son and other children from that community didn't even have access to a gym, that he thought he had to come to prison where his father was in order to play in a gym. And I think that's a sad state of our communities, and those are the kind of investments we need to make, as John was talking about, to move people before they go into the system so we can have a smaller footprint in that system.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your experiences and sharing that with us. And I'm so glad to hear so many of you have so many answers to these problems. And reminding us that, yes, you've made progress, but there's still so much to do. I mean, I'm assuming the 77 people online and all of us care so deeply. And I come here to really ask specifically, what more can I do? As well as maybe what more can all of us collectively do to support, one action or 2 actions. I will just say, though, because mindset came up and humanizing, right, Leann, and I think the others, you did too, Stanley, right? And for me, I just want to ask you a question that speaks to, when I hear mindset, I think about TM, that's been doing transcendental meditation for 35 years, and talk about stats. I think John was saying how important stats were, that it reduces recidivism by 30%. It reduced rule infractions. I think of Mandela, who came out, said, I wouldn't let them imprison my mind, even though they imprison my body. Or Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz, who said, right, who came out with that. So I know there's so much to do, but I wanted those two questions. What more could I do, could we do? And what do you think of something like transcendental meditation, where I think it might impact both the prisoner and the environment?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think all options are on the table. Like there's we was talking about this earlier, I don't think there's one solution to this particular problem. So I think the services, and this is when the new borough-based jail system, will have spaces for providers to come in and to provide the kind of services you just talked about, case management, counseling, meditation, the kind of services that could make a difference for people when they return. So yes, we need to do that. And it is critically important that we all lean in with those options. Like the diversity of our coalition and the diversity of our approaches, I think gives us the strength we need to attack this very wicked problem. As far as what could people do, there are a lot of coalitions out there, Close Rikers. There are a lot of coalitions that are asking people to join, to speak out, to talk truth, to let our elected leaders know that we want to center our system on the humanity of everybody, that we don't have to have winners and losers. And that was a big thing for me. We don't have to have winners and losers. We can have winners and winners, but it's going to take boldness, it's going to take leadership, and it's going to take the collective of all of us to make it happen. So join us.
I go to rallies, I sign petitions, especially for solitary confinement, because I shiver when I think of that torture.
Yeah.
We know it to be torture. So, and it doesn't appear that, for TM, the David Lynch Foundation, for instance, funds it. I mean, they're getting the funding, and I'm hearing, money, and so, what 5 things could all of us focus on of the, yes, does your son need a basketball court, and should it be his educational system and his community? And I believe me, I know, I hear, but I'm just still saying, can we all leave with 1 or 2 things that all of us are committing to do? We all care, right? We came because we care. Yeah. So just to be that specific, I'm happy to follow through with whatever 1 or 2 things you literally can say, hey, everybody here, if you did this, that would be great.
What you're doing is great, I should just say that.
Leann and then Lou.
Yeah, I think it's great there's people that care. There's not enough people that care about people who end up in the criminal justice system. And I say the criminal justice system as whole because, frankly, sometimes the sentence happens once they step out of the incarcerative sentence. There are so many secondary consequences, collateral consequences that keep people from really being able to break the cycle and keep getting pulled down. So they're barred from having this employment, they're barred from doing this, voter rights, you name it. And so at the end of the day, I think we have to give people the opportunity and not just keep that criminal offense from breaking free of where they need to be. So along with advocating for better conditions of incarceration, there needs to be opportunities once they get out of there. And frankly, some people end up with a lifetime sentence for a very minor thing because of their record. And each jurisdiction varies among that, but there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done among those lines.
Thank you. Louis, you want to?
Yes, I would like to say this, particularly to the state where you're speaking about 1 or 2 things affecting policy, if you will. In the smallest facet, an individual that's incarcerated has lost all of their rights to vote. They have lost all of their rights to ever serve in the armed services. They have lost all of their rights to ever serve as a firefighter. Any kind of life-saving opportunity, which you would be amazed to the talents that are inside of the criminal justice system, incarcerated, just wasting away inside of jails. You would be amazed by this. So if you can do anything, it would just, whether it be speak to the policymakers Speak to those individuals that are impacting. If you yourself are a policymaker or a policy writer, changing it from the multifaceted approach, as Mr. Richards has stated, because this thing, it just is so vast and so inserted inside of the system in and of itself of America, because it's a chattel mentality that people are no longer people. So once that mentality comes in, that humanity that you're speaking about, through transcendental meditation, through those kind of things, that approach in and of itself, upon my release, the very first thing, within the first week, I went to my community board 5, and I said I was a detriment to this community, and I'm here to serve. I carried chairs for free. I serviced on events for seniors. And was there sweating my eyes out, working because I felt like I had to give back. The reality is that nobody's holding people, whether they be accountable or responsible, to these different approaches that the panelists are speaking about, alternatives to incarceration. You're not going to be incarcerated, but you need community service. You need to service this community that you maybe even ravaged. Those kind of approaches are inventive approaches that actually the judge can take. But these judges are elected and put into offices, and nobody's holding them accountable. I feel some kind of way as a personal individual that from my release, I've been paying taxes and releasing my tax records from day one. And we have people in the highest offices that have yet to show their tax records.
Is it another question?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
So my question is twofold. One is Mayor Adams is cutting city budgets by 3%. Mayor Adams is cutting city budgets by 3% except for uniform services. And that's going to make it very difficult to have enough money to have the alternatives to incarceration, the mental health services, and the most important thing of all, which is supportive, affordable housing. So I would like you to address what's going to happen to all the things that are supposed to be in place before Rikers closes and the 3,300 maximum number of people can be put in the borough jails. But I wanted to answer your question. The one thing that you can do is you can call and write to Mayor Adams and tell him to decarcerate now and to close Rikers now, because things are in place, but there are not enough of things in place, and this is going to be a catastrophe before it even gets off the ground. So Stanley or anybody else, if you could please talk about how are we going to make anything happen when the budget's being slashed?
Yeah, I think it's what John stated. Budgets are about choices. And if we value decarceration, if we value thriving and healthy and safe communities, then we need to make those investments. And I think it is an ongoing conversation with this administration about what this city should be investing in. And I think over decades of city leadership, what we have seen is the city wanting to invest in solutions that cost a nickel and can fix every problem within 6 months. And we need to shift and make a real investment in decarceration, supportive housing, mental health services, community-based services, and we need to shift to community solutions that are created by communities. Because our tendency is to go in and say, we know what you need, as opposed to what is it that you want, what is it that you need from us, so that you can do what you have always done and create safe spaces in your community. So yes, those investments, budgets, I think are a statement about what we invest in and what we choose to do. And we need to let this administration know that we need to make long-term investments in the things that will make a difference. And, you know, Fortune Society's been building out supportive housing. We've been working with this administration to continue to bring on units of housing for people impacted by the justice system, but we need to continue to do it because the work that we're doing and other providers are doing is really a drop in the bucket. But we need to make long-term investments.
Thank you. Any other questions before I, and then I'll get right back to you.
They cost too much money.
Hi. So we understand that we have a school-to-prison pipeline, but I do want to address the fact that I feel personally from working in the shelter system that we also have this prison-to-shelter pipeline, if you will. And I wanted to discuss more about that because it's like they come straight from out of prison with the same, you know, prison mentality, and a lot of them have serious mental health conditions. And what do you think is the best way to address that? Because a lot of these, like, you know, to even get them admitted into, you know, services, it's voluntary. How do we address that? And do you think that it's necessary that we make it mandatory that those that are in the shelter system with severe mental health issues actually be admitted and without, you know, their voluntary consent?
There should definitely be a screening process. In the beginning of COVID, the previous administration reached out to Exodus to manage hotels for people coming out of Rikers Island. They wanted to reduce the number because jails were not made for COVID, right? So no social distancing. So the infection rates were high. We're getting people out of Rikers. We went from 5,500 to 3,800. But we were not prepared for the mental health challenges, and I've done this work for 23 years. We were not prepared. There was no screening process. People were released without medications, and by medications, some of it being methadone as well. So our city has to do a better job at figuring out kind of what's the scale, is it serious mental health, and what do we do with SMI, and what do we do with other folk, and just to make sure, again, the entire process is humanized. We wouldn't want to see that happen, but because of that, and because of the non-caring that goes along when people are released, I don't want to say dump, but yes, the shelter is the place they go, and they have to stay there to get the voucher, to go through all these other things, but I think we have to be able to put some wraparound services in there as well, to make sure that we are meeting the needs of those that really need it. Again, I've seen it firsthand. I know all of us here have seen it firsthand. We work in this area. But yeah, a better screening process on how we do this, an investment, and also saying why are they locked up anyway, initially. I mean, you know, that's a different story, but we really got to tackle that on the front end as well.
And I think, you know, in the country, we really deal with mental illness as like they are being resistant, like there's this resistance. And I think we need to shift our approach and need to ask people. You know, at Fortune Society, we have a mental health clinic. And if somebody starts decompensating and not taking their medication, we don't say, you need to go be hospitalized. We say, why did you stop taking the medication? And you'd be surprised. People will answer you. They'll say, because that medication makes me feel lethargic, that medication makes me feel this, that. And so how do you begin to shift the dialogue with people with mental illness? Same thing with people living on the street. Rather than saying, get up, get out of here, you shouldn't be living, why are you sleeping on the street? You know, they'll tell you, because if I go to a shelter, it's pretty violent in there. Or if I go to a shelter, it's pretty bad in there. Or people don't treat me right, or my people steal my stuff. And so I think as a country, we need to shift our way of working with people with mental illness. And we need to make sure, and I think Leann said this, jails are not the place for people with mental illness. And we need to undo that.
So our time is up. I want to thank Mike Jacobson for putting this together, ISLG that's doing this great work, the CUNY Grad Center. I want to thank our panelists, John, Leann, Louis, and Stanley. I mean, fantastic work. I want to thank the audience for coming out. Again, if there's one thing you can do, really think about that. Right now, there's a lot of traction around the Fair Chance Housing Act. We can really look at it to make sure people do have an opportunity to not be discriminated against to try to find an apartment. So again, I want to thank you all for this opportunity. Have a good night.
Thank you.